I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, just like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long, long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes it is. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long, long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes it is. Said I go to the movies and I go downtown. They keep telling me don't you hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know change gon' come. Yes, it is. Then I go to my brother and I say, brother, help me please. And he winds up, knocking me back down on my knees. There are times when I thought I wouldn't last for long, but now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes it is.
Well, good morning. Where's Dina? Dina, thank you for the invite. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy that law enforcement could be part of the conversation this morning. The theme, A Change Has Come, is very appropriate in the world of law enforcement in light of current circumstances we are experiencing throughout our country. As I was preparing my notes for today's event, I could not help but think of the many domestic and international events in which people are divided. Is this better? In which people are divided against one another, whether by race, religion, or even those around us simply choosing right from wrong or legal from illegal. Regardless of the circumstance, the division of people against one another in a community divided based on differences is a disconnection from the humanity and charity we all desire. Each of us wants our actions to be judged with compassion. Yet we quickly condemn others for their actions without fully understanding the circumstances and this needs to change. The violence in our world, and sometimes even in our own community, is often what motivates the information we are exposed to. Sometimes even what we focus on as a society, whether real or perceived. If we are not mindful, these incidents can fray the social fabric and the bonds within our community. What about the thousands of incidents we never hear about? The times in which conflict is resolved peacefully, where community members come together to support one another, to learn about one another, and to look and to overlook differences and connect with each other. As the chief of police for Vancouver, what I know and what I am proud of is that each and every day I hear about those incidents of peaceful resolution, good work being done, people choosing right from wrong, community members coming together to build relationships within neighborhoods, to overlook differences and to value and respect the diversity that builds upon and strengthens our bond as a community. As human beings, I believe we are all on a lifelong quest to learn from our mistakes, to own up to those mistakes, to seek improvement, and to find better outcomes for the future. As a law enforcement professional for the past 29 years, I have witnessed firsthand the good and bad in people, and sometimes what appears to be the blurred lines of our justice system. Today, law enforcement administrators across the country are discussing ways in which we can narrow, not widen, the gap between the community and the police. We also acknowledge the mutual desire to understand one another, to reduce suspicion and build trust. This is an opportunity to invest in each other the time and commitment to equally support our democratic society. I also know that to achieve an improved outcome for our future and to truly learn from our mistakes, we must experience and embrace change. Change can be difficult whether you are an individual, a group, or an industry. However, status quo is our enemy. It is a comfort zone that inhibits growth. I'm honored to be a part of an industry which is in the midst of what I believe is change for the better. Law enforcement is moving away from what many see as a warrior mentality to a guardian approach that teaches officers, whenever possible, to incorporate listening, explaining, equity, and dignity in their interactions with the public. The current Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission is teaching new police recruits under this model. In fact, the Academy Director has recently been invited by the White House to participate as a task force panel member. This speaks volumes to the progress the police industry is now heading. This is not to say officers are not also being trained to use force. We know this remains a reality and sometimes necessary to keep peace and order in our community. However, this new model provides officers additional means to work with during rapidly evolving incidents and as they encounter an ever-expanding and changing world. Since coming to Vancouver, I was pleased to learn we have already established citizen groups working together with the police department. One is the Chief's Diversity Advisory Team, which brings together community members representing many diverse groups to share in open dialogue and develop relationships with the police and their community. Members of this group participated on our hiring and promotional panels and helped develop ideas to enhance outreach to the community. One of the recently completed projects that were inspired by the Diversity Advisory Team was a series of multilingual public service announcements on topics including what to do during a traffic stop and physical discipline of children. These types of messages are important to help increase understanding around why police do what they do, and to clarify information that many people may not have previously known. Another group is our Neighbors on Watch volunteers. These community members volunteer their time to assist us to prevent and deter crime. They have helped us locate stolen vehicles, missing children, and elderly people, and routinely patrol their neighborhoods as an active crime prevention team. Both of these citizen-led groups are a great boost to our community policing efforts and are directly responsible for making Vancouver a safe, livable, and inclusive community. Community policing can mean many things. For me and for the Vancouver Police Department, it means citizens and police working together to solve problems, having meaningful dialogue, and building actual relationships. To this end, this past year, I met with the AME Zion Church Social Change Group, a local interfaith community group, and several others. Community engagement is a part of an officer's role that must be embraced. Through this engagement, we become connected and build upon our community's strength, which leads to a more vibrant and safe community. Police alone cannot keep our community safe. It takes all of us working together with mutual respect and trust, being that collective guardian for our community. The Chiefs Diversity Advisory Team and the Neighbors on Watch are just two of those guardian groups that step up and lead the change we desire. As we reflect on and celebrate the work of Dr. King, I ask you to get involved, step outside of any paradigm or comfort zone you might find yourself in, and join the guardians of our community to build upon its strength. Participate in the National Day of Service, join a citizen board, your neighborhood association, a police department volunteer group, or simply go on a police ride-along. Most of all, I ask you to look past the negativity of the world around us from time to time and seek the good around you. Provide an opportunity to build a bridge between law enforcement and the community. We are all in this together. The community are the police, and the police is the community. We are all responsible to serve as guardians of Vancouver, our home and community we all value. Thank you.
How y'all doing today? You know what? I was talking to a gentleman in line when I was getting some food. He was like, "How are you doing?" I said, "You know what? I'm doing really well, but I was like, what would have made this event even more special for me?" And this is selfish. I was like, if they would have hit that the dial on the heat just a little bit more, because brother, it's freezing up there. And the gentleman who I was talking, who's the gentleman I was talking to? Raise your hand. He knows who he is. Yeah. So he looks over to me and goes, "You just need more meat on your bones." You know what I mean? So maybe that's what it is. I'm honored to be here. I'm especially honored to be here because I don't often get a chance to come to Vancouver, the city of Vancouver, come to the colleges in the city of Vancouver and just dialogue and break bread and try to speak, you know, and bear witness to the things that make sense in my life and try to connect it to something that makes sense for all of us. But before I even get started about me and a little bit of what I want to talk about, I want to just give a special shout out, and Dina's beginning to shout out from everybody that's come up here, but I'd be remiss if I didn't just say, Dina, thank you for reaching out to me. I appreciate the work that you're doing, and can y'all just give Dina one more round of applause? This is a beautiful thing. So I'm going to go a lot of different directions with this talk. I'm going to flow from trope to trope, moments to moments, ideas to ideas, theories to theories, and hopefully I can connect it to a theory of justice and community and equity and equality and all those things Martin Luther King espoused in the short time that I have. There's a lot on my mind. There's no shortage of things to talk about. So this will be an eclectic mix, an amalgamation of a lot of thoughts and ideas and just things that are running through my heart, my mind, and my spirit. One of the things that I appreciate the sister who introduced me, she kind of gave my bio and and talked a little bit about some of the things that I've done in the past. But what's interesting is I wrote my dissertation on the college experiences of black male undergraduates at private white colleges in the Pacific Northwest, and with a critique on what I thought kind of mainstream multicultural education was not doing to meet the needs of not only black males, but any group of students who found themselves historically or immediately on the margins. And so a lot of my work, a lot of my writing, a lot of my talks of the past have been about multiculturalism and kind of what we can do to re-theorize that and re-philosophize that and implement it in different ways. But probably about, what are we, it's 2015 now, probably around 3 or 4 years ago, leaning closer to the 4, I made a kind of sharp turn away from talking about multicultural education. I think in principle and in idea, it's an amazing thing, but in practice, I think it leaves a lot to be desired. That's a lecture and talk for a whole nother day, but I'm saying I believe in the equality, the equity, the community that it espouses, but oftentimes when things get negotiated in the mainstream, it gets co-opted and commodified, and it doesn't meet the needs of the people who have historically been on the margin. So what's interesting about that is I made a sharp turn away from thinking and writing about, not thinking, but writing about multicultural education, always keeping black males center of everything that I do and write about. But I started thinking about something that, by just looking at the audience, I can tell that all you all listen to hip hop music pretty regularly, and so I started writing about hip hop. But I started writing about hip hop in a particular way. I wanted to, as I call it, make sense of how black males are confronting the challenges of their day and how they are trying to interpret and negotiate their sense of purpose, meaning, and being within that context. So when Pastor Renee Ward came up here and gave the invocation with innovation, right, she had everybody sing the Negro National Anthem. And what's interesting about that is it's about lifting the voice, right, lifting the voice. But it's hard to lift the voice or even pay attention to that voice if systematically society is telling us those voices don't matter, right? And so I want to talk about those voices, and I want to center those voices and lift those voices and really kind of juxtapose it with a lot of what Martin Luther King had to say. One of the things that I'm always interested in is when I do talks, people read my bio, and so they, as my dear sister did, she says, Dr. Glenn is a vice president of this. He's a chief diversity officer of that. He's a professor of X. He's taught Y. But one of the things that's never mentioned in my bio that I want to talk about is I am a black man who's a vice president. I'm a black man who's a chief diversity officer. I'm a black man who's a professor. I'm a black man who's an author. And I'm not just saying that for some cosmetic reason to make you feel connected to me. I'm saying that because within the context of that blackness, right, there is a lived experience, a lived reality, a cultural sensibility that frames the way I do that work, right? And what's interesting about that is people don't want to talk about the reverse side of that. It frames the way you interpret my work, right? It frames how you interpret that work. And so we need to think critically about that today and the voices of people who have historically been on the margins. What's interesting about Dr. King is this, and I'll be honest, we in U.S. society, in Western civilization, we like to dichotomize complex situations. It's always an either or. We never like to talk about it with a both and. And so I was kind of caught up in that particular moment as a youngster when we had to study about Martin Luther King. We had to study about Malcolm X. So I could not, in my mind at that time, do a both and so I gravitated more to the ideas of Malcolm, right? I gravitated more to the ideas of Malcolm because growing up in the inner city, being black, single mom, and seeing, and I grew up during the time with the proliferation of gangs and those kind of things. Thank God I never got caught up in that stuff, but that's what was going on when I looked out of my window. And it was hard for me to see the social circumstances and the social realities and the injustice that was creating the context where people thought that being in a gang was better than trying to do some other things. And so this whole idea of how Martin Luther King in particular was framed to me within the context of a K-12 education, it didn't seem like Martin had enough bite to address what was going on. And it was a trip because I was getting taught Martin Luther King through kind of the K-12 education. And there are particular moments that index how we need to do better education around Martin Luther King. So you always remember in elementary school, they give you a picture of Martin Luther King, and you got to color his face, and then you put it outside the classroom, and he's pink, he's brown, he's yellow, he's red, he's all these different things, and it's cute, But at the same time, I don't know if that's given us the context of how radical he really was. And I remember I have two boys. My older son is 15. And I remember when he was in kindergarten, he came home with that colored picture of Martin Luther King. And I'm like, they still messing kids up. So I remember asking him, I'm like, man, who's Martin Luther King? This is my son. And he'd be mad right now if you heard the story. It's like, son, who's Martin Luther King? It's like, Dad, you know who Martin Luther King is. I was like, yeah, but you tell me who Martin Luther King is. He's like, Dad, you know, he freed the slaves. I was like, man, we got some work to do. We got some work. He was 5. I mean, come on, give him a break. I was like, close, but not really. And so what's interesting is we're inundated with the I Have a Dream speech. We're inundated with this idea of people being judged not by the color of their skin, but by the what? That's like on Burger King napkins now. I mean, it's been pretty commodified, right? And so, that's cool. I mean, that makes you feel good. But that's not really where I felt like we needed to push society to change. And so I did something. I started researching Martin Luther King. And what you will realize about Martin Luther King is the brother was radical. He was seriously radical. And so I'm not even going to talk about the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act, the Voters Rights Act, all those kind of things, Selma, Birmingham, all those things that were getting framed around the early 60s to the mid 60s. I want to talk about Martin Luther King from 1944 to 1954. And then I want to talk about Martin Luther King in 1967, the year before he got assassinated. Because what's very interesting about when you look at leadership, people think of leadership as something you just rolled out of bed. And he was Martin Luther King marching down, the streets of Selma. Here's the thing. Martin Luther King in 1944 was a freshman at Morehouse College, right? And I'm going to take you through kind of a 10-year journey of Martin Luther King really, really, really quickly. So Martin Luther King was at Morehouse College. Then he went to Crozer Theological Seminary. Then he did his PhD at Boston University. And if you look at that 10-year period of his life, it will really give you the making of the king, the making of Martin Luther King. Because one of the things that people want to think about leadership is that, like, you don't struggle with the issue of the day. Like, there was, like, not a time in his life where he was like, you know what, maybe this nonviolent stuff may not be the way we should go. You know, maybe... And I say this with love because you all are my dear brothers and sisters, but maybe white folks got some issues that are just not curable in this society, right? He wrestled with that. He really did. And so what's very interesting is when you look at Martin Luther King as a freshman, or at least when he started Morehouse, he's bringing to Morehouse his lived realities, his lived experiences, his cultural sensibilities, how he's making sense of the world. And he went to college not to chase a salary, not to chase a job, not to chase an automobile, not to chase to live in a particular neighborhood, but he wanted to make sense of what was going on in society and juxtapose that with his cultural sensibilities so he could address what he thought was shallow and superficial about America's will to justice. He says, and this is Martin Luther King speaking, he says when he came to college, he was perilously close to writing white folks off. Perilously close to writing white folks off. And it wasn't until he started reading the intellectual work of Thoreau and Thoreau's work on civil obedience or disobedience, depending on how you want to analyze the text, that he started to think about how can we have oppositional response to the evil that we are disproportionately facing. So he was wrestling with these particular things all through his first degree as a college student at Morehouse. I had the pleasure of interviewing and working with, over the last 2 days, 20 students who are seniors in high school, who are young people, first generation, low-income folks of color who are applying to get full tuition scholarships at Warner Pacific College. And it's so interesting to hear where young people are and how they think about their college journey and how they think about the process of education. And as I got a chance to sit down and dialogue with my young brothers and sisters, they kept on saying, Dr. Glenn, what should I major in? Dr. Glenn, what do you think this will do to help me get a job? And I said, if you come to college and you only think that this is a vehicle by which you are going to get a job, you will be passively complicit in reinforcing a negative status quo that's going to keep marginalization at its current form and even more deeper. I said, don't worry about that. And it's hard to tell people you're first gen, you come from a low-income family. I get it. I was that kid. It's hard to tell somebody that when you're looking at mama suffering, you're looking at your brothers and sisters needing something. It's hard to tell them the money will come. But I'm here to tell you, especially the young people, everybody that stood up who was under 20, if you find your passion and you intersect your passion with your skills, the money will come. You don't have to chase the money. Find out what you're passionate about. Find out what you're good at. Find out if everything was against you at 35 years old, what would get you out of bed in the morning. And that's where you'll find your purpose and your calling. Don't worry about all those other things. So I'm thinking about this. So I'm thinking about Martin Luther King, right? So I'm thinking about what he's doing. So he's this undergraduate student at Morehouse. But he says it wasn't until he went to seminary school, right? So he went to Crozier Theological Seminary where he really started to think critically about his faith. He started to think really critically about what was going on in society, and he started to think critically about how he could usher in a new way of doing this work. And I don't want to take you all through too much. I didn't set my timer, and I know I don't have a lot of time, but he was really looking at some really critical writers about what they had to say about injustice, what they had to say about justice. And Martin Luther King, you talk about quotes. He has some amazing quotes that came from that time. One of the things that he says he says, the absence of brutality doesn't mean there's a presence of justice. The absence of brutality doesn't mean that there's a presence of justice. Just like the absence of war doesn't suggest that there's a presence of peace. So we have to start looking at these things a little bit more critically and a little bit more nuanced. Let me give you a story. And I'm going to connect some things. I'm going to look at Trayvon Martin, and I'm going to look at Michael Brown, and I'm going to look at Eric Gardner and play with that for a moment. I remember when Trayvon Martin was killed by Zimmerman, as the story was articulated, he had on a hood. He was wearing a hoodie. He was coming out of a store, and he just bought some Skittles. And he was in a neighborhood that someone thought he shouldn't have been in, and then there became an altercation. We can not even be critical of what happened in that moment. None of us were there, but what we know is Trayvon Martin was killed. Now, for a lot of people, it's a tragedy. It's an abomination of justice, or however you want to frame it, or not. But let me tell you what was very interesting about this. When I was writing my dissertation, I was about 30 days away from defending my doctoral dissertation. And at the time, I was living in North Portland, and this is a true story. The last 30 days of writing my dissertation on multicultural education, on black males, on all these kind of different things around equality and higher education, I would get up. I wrote my dissertation from the hours of midnight to 5 in the morning. Okay, so I was always up late at night writing. But usually around 2 o'clock in the morning, just the last 30 days, I always had a taste for some Skittles. And it's a true story. I always had a taste for some Skittles. And so what I would do is get out of bed, 2 o'clock in the morning in North Portland, put on a hoodie, I said, brother, got a bald head, put on a hoodie, stay warm. And I would go to the corner store, which happened to be a 7-Eleven. It was about 2 blocks away I would drive. And I would walk up to the store. I would get out of my car. And I was always taking off my hood because 2 o'clock in the morning, I don't care what color you are, a person with a hoodie walking into a store can be a little bit intimidating. So I would do that. I would go home and get the Skittles and get back to typing and writing. Next day, I would do it again. And even though I was writing a dissertation, I don't know why I didn't have the intellectual acumen to just buy 5 packs at one time. I don't know why I was just doing that every day. But what's so interesting about that is in many ways, I could have been Trayvon. I was just a black dude with a hoodie on, buying Skittles, and could have been perceived or been at the wrong place at the wrong time. And so Trayvon's story really resonated to me in a particular way. But get this, when people would ask me about my work or invite me places to speak, I would share this with them. I would always say, listen, everybody, I don't always have a suit on. I don't walk around with a PhD around my neck. So when I'm not in a suit and I'm not on a stage and I'm not in a place where people already know me, I could be subject to the same thing that Trayvon Martin was subject to. But it sounded romantic. It was intellectually great. But somehow it was an elitist stance for me because it made it seem like because I'm wearing a suit and because I have a degree, somehow I'm exempt from the psychology of racism and injustice. And so something happened around the time the Michael Brown shooting happened in Ferguson. The verdict came. They chose not to indict Officer Wilson. And I was like, okay. And everybody's surprised, And I just went about my business. My son now, who's 15, he's outraged. Dad, there was no indictment. This is not right. I'm scared to walk down the streets telling me all these different things. And here I am, a black man who writes about black people with a specific focus on black males having no indignation about something. Something is wrong with that scenario. That injustice can be so normalized that it becomes business as usual, and we people who say we care about justice don't do anything about it. I was unsettled. I was deeply unsettled. I was praying on my knees like, God, help me make sense of this. So God and I have this relationship. When I ask him for things, he shows me very quickly. It's not always what I wanted to see or how I wanted to see it, but it comes very quickly. In between the time of Michael Brown's killing and Eric Gardner's killing, I'm trying to figure out what's going on and how I need to be more outraged and how I need to bring some analysis to this. True story again. And remember, connecting it back to, I was telling people, oh, if I didn't have on a suit and if I wasn't doing this, I can be subject to these things. I'm driving in a neighborhood. It's just about a month or two ago. I'm driving in a neighborhood to drop off something to a friend. And I know the friend is not there. So I put it in their mailbox. And it's one of those mailboxes that's still on the curb. You can just roll down your window and put it in there. It's a really nice neighborhood in Northeast Portland. And the backdrop of this story is I used to live on that neighborhood, in that neighborhood, and I bought a house in that neighborhood. So that's just some context. So my son is in the back seat with me. My older son's in the back seat with me. So I drop off what I was dropping off in the mailbox. I drive off from that neighborhood, and it's a nice neighborhood, so it extends a few blocks. I'm about 2 blocks away from where I dropped off the envelope that I was dropping off. But I was texting my friend to say, hey, no, you weren't there. Check your mailbox when you get back in. Now, get this, everybody. I have my son in the back seat. It is maybe like 8 o'clock in the evening on a work day. So I have my suit on still. My son's in the back seat. I'm 2 blocks away from where I dropped off the mail. And I approach a stop sign. I'll pull to the side as if I'm parking so I can text and not text and drive. I'm like trying to follow the rules. So here I am, black man in the neighborhood where I bought a home, where I used to live, with my son in the back seat, with a suit on. I'm not trying to stunt, but driving a luxury car. Like, I got all these things that are not the justification of why people profile you, right? Or should be profiled. I am texting, and just a pretty short text, and my son says, "Dad, there's a white dude on the corner staring at you." And I was like, I don't care. Like, don't look at him, and just like, I'm gonna send this text, and we'll be done with this. And he's like, oh, okay. So I'm still kind of texting this. He's like, "Dad," he's still looking, and he's getting close to approaching the car. And I was like, now I got to pay attention to something. I don't know what's going on. So in the spirit of how I try to do things, I rolled down my window. And my exact words were, "Brother, can I help you?" And his response to me in a very stern and angry voice was, "No, can I help you?" As if to signify I didn't belong in that neighborhood. Now, here's what's interesting about this. It's cold outside. It's a dark night. It's a somewhat affluent neighborhood. I'm in a luxury car. I'm in a suit. I have my son in the back seat. We are the least threatening Negroes probably they've seen in that neighborhood for a while. And he's outside with no coat on. It's cold. He's not walking a dog. He seems like the suspect to me. Why am I getting treated like I'm the suspect? So he says to me, "No, can I help you?" in this very threatening voice. And I look at him, and my son's in the back seat. And I'm calm, and I say, "Nah, brother, you can't help me at all." And I roll back up my window. And so I get back to finishing texting. This guy comes in front of my car and takes down my license plate number and tries to call the police. And I'm thinking, remember, I prayed to God to show me something, to get me uncomfortable so we could do this work the right way. A week later, that situation happens. Y'all, we got to do better. We got to be better. And what's interesting is, thinking back to Martin Luther King's work, 1967, he writes a book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And it's really his last writings before he's assassinated. And what's so very interesting about Martin Luther King in this particular moment is we've already had the March on Washington. We've already had the Civil Rights Act. We've already had the Voting Rights Act. And guess what? Martin Luther King in 1967 is more angry now than he was with that March on Washington, the stuff in Selma, the stuff in Birmingham. Because what he says is the easiest thing to do is integrate a lunch counter. The easiest thing to do is to integrate schools. The easiest thing to do is pass legislation so we can vote. He said, but the hardest thing it's going to be is for the Negro to have real equality in America. And I was thinking really, really hard about that. He was reflecting on the Watts riots. And he says, I am not going to be as critical about the people who are rioting because rioting is the language of the unheard. And so Martin Luther King had this very nuanced and beautiful way of being both and. So he could be critical of rioting that could be violent, but he was also saying, I am not going to be critical of the people who are rioting without being critical of the systems and the structures and the circumstances that created the reality for rioting to exist in the first place. So he had all this kind of stuff he was playing with. And so there was a lot of other things that Martin Luther King said, but it will unsettle you all, and I want y'all to be able to have a great ride home. But what I will say is he was challenging stuff seriously. And I challenge you to really think about the critiques that he had on society, the critiques that he had on a lot of things. I want to close with something. I don't think this has ever been done before. I'm going to juxtapose the charge of Martin Luther King with hip hop culture. I think I can do this, right? If I can't, I'm going to blame it on the listener, not the rapper. So get this. Hip hop is a very interesting cultural art form, in that if you think about it in juxtaposition to the riot, right? Rioting is a voice, or the voices of the unheard. Hip hop emerged from a context because people felt like they weren't being heard. And what's interesting and how it connects with the civil rights movement is these are the folks in the post-civil rights era who are finding themselves in what I like to call post-industrial America and deindustrialized space, trying to wrestle with, did the dream really come to pass? And so what they found in 10 years later, from the assassination of Martin Luther King, where the dream was supposed to be somewhat realized, the laws and all these kind of things were in their favor, they found themselves suffering disproportionately in urban spaces. And so what they tried to do is create a particular art form that shed light on the suffering, lifted their voices, but they also wanted to have fun at the same time, right? So it's all these kind of different things that are happening. But what's interesting about hip hop is hip-hop is critiqued at a particular level that rioting was critiqued in Martin Luther King's era, because you are trying to focus on what I like to call the nihilistic aspect of hip-hop music and not focus on the very structures and systems and processes that made that nihilism present in the first place, right? And so King had this great way of doing that. But I always find it interesting when people critique hip hop. If you listen closely to the critiques of hip hop, it's not about the rapping and the ability to rhyme words. It's the content when it's negative, but it's a really, really sophisticated critique on the people that made the music in the first place. And that scares me. I'm going to say that again. It doesn't become a critique necessarily on the music itself, even though it does. There's some nihilistic pieces, but it becomes a critique on the people who are producing the music in the first place. Like they are inferior in certain ways. So what's very interesting is if you all want to take a Kingsian philosophy into the 2015 and abroad, I want you all to think about hip hop. And your relationship to hip hop is going to tell me a lot about your relationship to suffering and your relationship to hearing the voices of the people. And I'm going to give you a 5-point framework in less than 2 minutes about how to do that. The first thing you have to do is when people have historically been suffering is you have to give credence to the art that they create in the first place, right? So when people ask me, hey, Dr. Glenn, what do you think about hip hop? I say, you mean that critical, reality-based, postmodern cultural art form and aesthetic practice? That I dig, right? And it's critical. Why? It's critical because it has a critique on the various values and norms in society. It's reality-based because it's looking at the needs and the interests of the people who are on the margins. It's postmodern because it is a particular art form that challenges the modern Enlightenment period of the previous centuries, where we wrestle with objectivity and subjectivity and truth, right? It's aesthetic because it's brilliantly nuanced, and it has a beauty of flow and tempo and cadence. And it's an art form because it's producing a particular type of a contribution that's wrestling with the lives and the realities of people on the ground. But here's another thing. When you think about hip hop, I want you to do a couple things. Look at it as being, I know you're not going to remember this, but critical, reality-based, postmodern cultural art form and aesthetic practice. I want you to also think about that it provides, on a high moment, amazing and robust cultural commentary and cultural critique of what's going on. But here's where we get locked in. There's also nihilistic elements of hip hop. And Dr. Cornel West defines nihilism as, and I know I'm coming to a close, but I'm like a Baptist preacher. I got to end 3 times. But so I'm getting there. I'm getting there, I promise. Dr. West describes nihilism as being psychological depression, social despair, helplessness, hopelessness, and what he calls, worst of all, lovelessness, right? And so what happens, right, is people are psychologically depressed. They're in social despair. And oftentimes when they're in those moments, they respond to their situation from that psychological space. And unfortunately, it replicates and reproduces their marginalization. But you just don't let them off the hook there, right? You challenge that. But then you go on to this idea of, and I was talking to my sister earlier. She was like, I heard you talking. You went really deep. Are you going to go deep on us today? I said, I'm not going to try to go deep, but I think I'm going to go just a little bit, because there's another piece of this, and that is the existential spiritual angst that's going on within the art form. And for this conversation, just think about existential spiritual angst as a marginalized group trying to make sense of meaning, being, and purpose within that context of suffering. A search for meaning and being and purpose. Why am I here? What am I supposed to do? And how am I going to be judged based on how I respond to my moment? And I think the last thing is storytelling. There's an art of storytelling to the art. And I like to say counter narratives, where people are able to provide counter narratives to what their experiences are, unlike how they're being portrayed in mainstream society. I'll leave you with kind of 2 things to think about, because there's so many different directions I can go. Martin Luther King said this. He says, the Negro finds himself in a triple ghetto. A ghetto of race, a ghetto of poverty, and a ghetto of human misery. And the charge is, how are we going to extend King's legacy and respond to that human misery, that psychological depression, that social despair, that helplessness, that hopelessness, and that lovelessness. And I think a refashioned model of lifting the voices of the everyday people, centering the voices of people on the margin, understanding the circumstances and the structures and systems that created the misery in the first place, and address that, I think we'll be going somewhere. The last thing I want to say is this. Martin Luther King said that the line of progress is never straight. It always bends. And he says, it's like you're driving to a city and you approach a mountain. You have to bend to drive around the mountain. And there's times where you think you're going backwards, and there's times that you think you're not making any progress. But then you get to the other side of the mountain and you see the city again, and you realize that you're even closer. God bless you, and thanks for having me today.